bolt of blue calico cost 40 cents, and Maylin Zhao counted the coins twice before she set them on the counter, because in Prosperity Gulch, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1879, a Chinese widow could not afford to be short a single penny in front of witnesses. She was 27 years old, and she had buried her husband 8 months ago in a plot of hard clay behind the laundry they had built together. And since that day she had learned that grief was a private thing, but poverty was public, examined by every person in town who felt entitled to an opinion about how she spent what little she had left. The general store smelled of leather and coffee beans and the particular dust that never seemed to settle anywhere in this territory, and May kept her eyes on the counter, on the scale, where Otis Pruitt weighed her purchase with the careful suspicion he showed no other customer. She had come in for thread and fabric to mend the laundry's curtains, nothing more, but she had also come because she needed flour, and flour meant she would have to walk past the row of men sitting outside on the porch benches, the ones who watched her the way men watch something they have already decided about. But what she did not expect, what she could not have prepared for, even after 8 months of learning this town's cruelties, was that today would be the day Otis Pruitt refused to sell her the flour at all. May was born in Canton and had come to America at 19 with her husband Way, following the promise of railroad work that paid better than anything in the old country. And when the Central Pacific finished its grading through the Sierra passes, they had drifted east with the rest of the laborers, looking for the next town that needed hands willing to work for less than white men would accept. Prosperity Gulch had needed a laundry. Way had known how to run one from his uncle's business back home, and for 6 years they had scrubbed shirts and pressed collars and saved every coin toward the day they might buy a small parcel of land outside town and grow something that belonged to them alone. Then the fever took Way in the space of 4 days, and May had buried him herself, because the town's undertaker charged double for what he called foreign burials, and she had not had the money to argue. Since then she had kept the laundry running on her own, though half her regular customers had quietly drifted to the newer laundry that opened on the east side of town, run by a white family who charged more, but who the townsfolk trusted with their good shirts. May understood the arithmetic of it without anyone needing to explain. She was a widow, she was foreign, and she was alone. And in this town, those 3 facts added up to something less than a person in most people's eyes. She reached the counter and set down her list, careful and neat in the English lettering Way had taught her over years of quiet evening lessons by lamplight. Otis Pruitt read it without looking at her, his mustache twitching the way it did when he was working up to saying something unpleasant. "Flour's short this month," he said. "Got regular customers to serve first." "I have the money," May said, and she did, folded carefully in a handkerchief inside her sleeve, money she had earned pressing shirts until her hands cracked and bled in the dry summer heat. "I only need 1 sack." "Regular customers," Otis said again, and this time he looked at her, and there was nothing kind in his face at all. "You understand me, Mrs. Zhao." May understood him perfectly. She had understood men like Otis Pruitt since the day she stepped off the train in this territory. Men who smiled at her money when they needed it and turned their backs when they did not. She stood very still, the way she had learned to stand when the ground beneath her wanted to shift, and she considered her options with the same clear calculation she brought to every ledger at the laundry. Behind her she heard the door open and the particular quiet that fell over a room when someone the town respected walked into it. She did not turn around. She had learned that turning around only invited more eyes. "Otis," a voice said, low and unhurried. You're out of flour for Mrs. Zhao, but you got a full barrel sitting right there behind you. That right?" May did turn then, because the voice belonged to no one she recognized, and what she found surprised her enough that she forgot for a moment to keep her expression carefully blank. The man standing near the door was tall in the way of men who worked outdoors, his shoulders broad beneath a plain cotton shirt gone soft from years of washing, his hat held in both hands instead of on his head, which struck her as unusual, since most men in this town did not remove their hats for anyone, let alone a stranger standing at a counter. He was not looking at her the way the other men looked at her. He was looking at Otis Pruitt, and there was something steady in his gaze that made the storekeeper's mustache stop twitching entirely. "That flour's spoken for," Otis said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Funny," the stranger said. "I was in here Tuesday, and you told me you had 3 barrels and no buyers lined up. Barrels don't spoil that fast, Otis, even in this heat." The silence that followed stretched long enough that May felt the weight of every eye in the store, and she understood that whatever happened next would be remembered and repeated across Prosperity Gulch by supper time. She had not asked for a rescue. She had never asked for a rescue in her life, and pride made her want to set her coins on the counter and walk out without the flour rather than accept help she had not requested. But the stranger was not looking at her for gratitude. He had already turned his attention back to Otis, patient and unbothered, as though he had all the time in the world to stand there and wait for the storekeeper to reconsider his arithmetic. Otis Pruitt weighed out the flour without another word, his jaw tight, his hands moving faster than they needed to. May paid him the correct amount, counted precisely, and did not thank him, because gratitude was not owed to a man who had only done what decency required in the first place. She picked up her flour and her calico and turned to leave, and it was only then that she looked directly at the stranger who had spoken up for her, taking in the details she had missed in the tension of the moment. He had sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, and a scar along his jaw that looked old, healed long before she had ever come to this territory. He nodded to her once, brief and formal, and stepped aside to let her pass through the door first. "Obliged you didn't need to do that," May said, because some acknowledgment felt owed, even if gratitude did not. "Wasn't doing you a favor," the man said. "Just don't care for a man cheating a paying customer on account of what she looks like. That's a different thing." May studied him for a moment longer than was polite, trying to place him among the faces of Prosperity Gulch, and found she could not. "I don't believe I know you." "Silas Reed," he said. "Got a spread about 6 miles east, past the Hendricks place. Don't come to town much." He said this last part almost apologetically, as though his own absence from town life were something he owed her an explanation for, and May found the humility strange in a man who had just stood down Otis Pruitt without raising his voice once. "May Zhao," she said. "I run the laundry on 2nd Street." "I know it," Silas said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Passed by it plenty of times. Always looked well kept." It was such a small thing to say, so unremarkable compared to the insults and dismissals she had grown accustomed to, that May found herself unsure how to respond. She settled for a small nod, adjusted the flour sack against her hip, and continued on her way down the dusty street, aware without quite understanding why that Silas Reed's eyes followed her for longer than politeness required. She did not think much more about the encounter until 3 days later, when she found him standing outside the laundry with a bundle of shirts under one arm and an expression that suggested he had been standing there working up the nerve to knock for some time before she opened the door. "Got some shirts need washing," he said, which was not, May would learn, entirely true, since 2 of the 3 shirts in the bundle were already clean and had clearly been added just to give him a reason to come. "I can have these ready by Thursday," May said, taking the bundle and doing the mental arithmetic on what he owed her, though something in her hesitated to name a price to a man who had already refused payment in the form of her gratitude once already. "No rush," Silas said, and then, before she could close the door, added, "You settling in all right? Since Otis." The question was simple enough, ordinary enough, that May nearly answered it the way she answered every question about her circumstances in this town, with a polite deflection meant to close the conversation quickly. But something in the careful way he asked it, like he actually wanted the true answer rather than the polite one, made her pause. "I manage," she said, which was closer to honest than most of her answers to that question. "It is not always easy, but I manage." Silas nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands the way he had at the general store, a habit she was beginning to recognize as something he did when he was thinking through what to say next. "Town's got a way of forgetting who does the work that keeps it running," he said. "Seen it before. Don't make it right." May felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for, some small crack in the careful wall she had built around herself since Way died, and she found herself studying Silas Reed's face for signs of pity or condescension, the things she had learned to expect from anyone who spoke kindly to her in this town. She found neither. What she found instead looked like simple, unremarkable honesty, and that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. "Thursday," she said again, retreating to the safety of business. "Your shirts will be ready Thursday." Silas nodded, put his hat back on his head for the first time since she had known him, and walked away down the street with the loose, unhurried gait of a man who had never once in his life needed to prove anything to anyone watching. The town of Prosperity Gulch operated according to rules May had spent 6 years learning by observation rather than instruction, and one of those rules concerned the annual Founders' Day gathering held each July in the square outside the courthouse, where the whole territory came together to eat, trade gossip, and, for the unmarried, engage in the town's unofficial matchmaking ritual that everyone pretended was simply a dance and a shared meal. May had not planned to attend this year. Widows in her position did not typically receive invitations to sit at the long tables set up under the cottonwoods, and she had spent the last 2 Founders' Days working quietly at the laundry while the rest of the town celebrated without her. But this year, the wife of the mercantile owner had specifically told her the laundry would need to close for the day regardless, since half the town's able bodies would be occupied at the square, and there would be no customers to serve. So May found herself standing at the edge of the gathering in her best dress, a deep blue silk she had brought from Canton and rarely had occasion to wear, watching a town she had lived in for 6 years celebrate itself without quite including her in the celebration. She watched the ritual unfold the way she had heard other women describe it. Unmarried men approaching women they found interesting, offering to share the evening meal, a simple question that carried the weight of courtship in a territory where formal introductions were a luxury few could afford. She watched 3 different men approach 3 different women within the first half hour, watched the polite acceptances and occasional blushing refusals, and she understood, standing at the edge of it all, that she would receive no such offer tonight, because the men of Prosperity Gulch had made their opinion of her clear in 100 small ways over 6 years. She was preparing to slip away before anyone noticed her standing alone when a voice behind her, low and familiar, stopped her mid-step. "Evening, Mrs. Zhao." May turned to find Silas Reed standing a respectful distance away, hat once again in his hands, his best shirt pressed so carefully she wondered if he had done it himself or paid someone in town for the privilege, since she knew for a fact he had not brought it to her. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I did not expect to see you here. You said you don't care much for town gatherings." "Don't, generally," Silas admitted, "but I heard there'd be good reason to come this year." May felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she told herself it was only the summer heat, only the tightness of the dress she rarely wore anymore. "Is that so?" "Wondered," Silas said, and here his careful composure faltered slightly, a flush rising along his weathered jaw that May found more affecting than any smooth speech another man might have offered. "If you'd care to share supper with me tonight. Ain't much of a talker, and I know that, but I'd be glad of the company." Around them, May was aware of the sudden shift in attention, the way conversations near enough to hear had quietly stalled, the way several pairs of eyes had turned toward the widow from the laundry and the quiet rancher from east of town who had just, in front of half the county, asked her to supper. She understood in that moment that whatever answer she gave would become the talk of Prosperity Gulch by morning, that she was being watched and measured the way she had been measured every day for 6 years. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, May found she did not particularly care what the town thought of her answer. "I would like that," she said. "Thank you for asking." The relief that crossed Silas's face was so immediate and so unguarded that May nearly laughed, and the sound that came out of her instead was something close to it, a small, surprised huff of amusement that she had not allowed herself in months. Silas offered his arm, awkward and formal, and led her toward one of the long tables where supper was being served, and May was aware, walking beside him, of every eye in the square following their progress with an intensity that would have unsettled her deeply a week ago. Tonight, walking beside a man who had twice now chosen to stand beside her when standing beside her cost him something in this town's estimation, she found she could hold her chin level and let them watch. They sat at the end of one of the long tables, slightly apart from the main crush of the gathering, and Silas Reed proved, over the course of the meal, to be a man who spoke rarely but meant everything he said, a quality May had not encountered often in her years in this territory. He asked about the laundry, about Canton, about Way, and listened to her answers with a stillness that made her feel, for the first time since her husband's death, that someone in this town was actually interested in the answer rather than simply performing politeness. "Your husband," Silas said, turning his fork slowly in his hands, "sounds like he was a good man." "He was," May said. "He worked harder than anyone I ever knew, and he never once complained about the unfairness of it. I used to think that was strength. Now I wonder if it was only exhaustion he didn't have the energy to name." Silas considered this for a long moment before responding, and May found she appreciated the pause, the sense that he was actually weighing her words rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Lost my own wife," he said finally. 6 years back now. Fever took her, same as your husband, from what I understand of your story. Took me a long while to learn the difference between grieving and just being tired of everything." May felt something settle in her chest at his words, some quiet understanding that passed between them without needing further explanation. She had not expected to find, at a Founders' Day gathering she had almost skipped entirely, a man who understood the particular exhaustion of loss without needing it explained to him in detail. "Is that why you don't come to town much?" she asked. "Because it's easier out at your place, without people watching to see how you're managing?" "Something like that," Silas admitted. "Though I reckon I've been telling myself that story a lot longer than it's been true. Might be I just got comfortable being alone. Easier than risking losing something again." He looked at her then, direct and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch slightly. "Been thinking that might not be a good enough reason anymore." The music started up somewhere behind them, a fiddle and a guitar working through something slow and simple, and around them couples were beginning to drift toward the open ground where dancing would soon begin. May watched several other women rise to dance with men who had shared their table, and she felt the old familiar tension return, the awareness that she and Silas, sitting together at the edge of the gathering, had already drawn more attention than she was accustomed to receiving. But Silas did not seem inclined to notice or care about the attention. He simply asked, with the same careful formality he had shown asking her to supper, whether she might care to dance, and May, surprising herself, said yes. They had been dancing only a few minutes, Silas proving surprisingly competent despite his obvious discomfort with being watched, when the evening's fragile peace broke apart entirely. A man May recognized as Franklin Doss, who ran the freight office and had never once in 6 years spoken a civil word to her, pushed through the edge of the crowd with 2 companions trailing behind him, all 3 of them carrying the loose, careless confidence of men who had spent the afternoon at the whiskey tent rather than the supper tables. "Didn't figure Reed for the type to go slumming," Franklin said, loud enough to carry across half the square, and the music faltered as the fiddle player lost his rhythm at the sudden tension in the air. "Whole territory of decent women here tonight, and you picked the laundry woman." May felt her spine go rigid, the old familiar humiliation rising in her chest. But before she could decide how to respond, Silas had stepped forward, putting himself slightly ahead of her without releasing her hand entirely, his posture shifting into something May had not seen from him before, coiled and ready in a way that suggested the gentle rancher held reserves of steel beneath his quiet manner. "You want to finish that thought, Franklin?" Silas said, his voice still low, but carrying an edge now that silenced the last of the murmuring around them. "You might want to think real careful about where you're standing when you do." Franklin's 2 companions shifted uneasily, but Franklin himself, emboldened by whiskey or simple stubbornness, pressed on. "Just saying what half this town's thinking. Woman like that, taking work from decent families, and now trying to work her way into a good man's household through his bed instead of his laundry basket." The words landed like a slap, and May felt heat flood her face, humiliation and fury tangled together so tightly she could not immediately separate them. But before she could speak, before Silas could do whatever his tightened jaw suggested he was considering, a third voice cut through the tension, unexpected and sharp. "That's enough, Franklin Doss." The voice belonged to Ruth Kellerman, the blacksmith's widow, a woman May had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 6 years of living in this town, standing now with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she had exhausted her patience with Franklin's behavior long before tonight. "This woman has kept this town in clean shirts and pressed linens for 6 years without a single complaint about her work," Ruth said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent square. "And you stand here and insult her honor because a good man had the sense to see what the rest of you were too small-minded to notice. You ought to be ashamed." Franklin opened his mouth to respond, but found, apparently, that Ruth Kellerman's public rebuke combined with the crowd's shifting mood left him with nothing useful to say. He muttered something under his breath about not meaning any disrespect, which convinced no one, and retreated with his companions toward the whiskey tent, leaving behind a silence that May could not immediately read. But therefore, into that silence, something unexpected happened. A few scattered voices, then more, began to murmur agreement with Ruth's assessment, and May realized, standing there with Silas's hand still holding hers, that perhaps not everyone in Prosperity Gulch shared Franklin Doss's opinion of her. Perhaps some had simply never found the occasion to say otherwise. "You all right?" Silas asked quietly, once the crowd's attention had drifted elsewhere and the fiddle player had cautiously resumed his tune. "I'm used to it," May said, which was true, though tonight the old familiar wound felt different somehow, softened by the unexpected defense from a woman she barely knew and the steady presence of the man still holding her hand. "Shouldn't have to be used to it," Silas said. "Not here. Not anywhere." May looked up at him, taking in the tension still visible in his shoulders, the protective anger he had not entirely released even after Franklin's retreat, and she felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for 8 long months. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight. For all of it." "Wasn't nothing," Silas said, though his ears had gone slightly red, the same tell she had noticed at the general store when he first spoke up for her. "It was something," May said. "It was quite a lot of something, actually." They finished the dance in a silence that felt entirely different from the awkward silence of the meal's beginning, something warmer settling between them, and when the music finally ended, Silas walked her back toward the edge of the square where the laundry cart she had borrowed for the evening stood waiting. "I'd like to call on you again," Silas said, standing beside the cart with his hat once more in his hands. "If you'd allow it. Proper courting, I mean, not just supper at a gathering where half the town's watching to see if I'll embarrass myself." May considered him for a long moment, this quiet rancher who had twice now stood between her and this town's cruelty without expecting anything in return, and found that the answer came easily, without the careful calculation she usually applied to every decision in this territory. "I would like that very much," she said. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to May's days that she had not experienced since before Way's death, a quiet anticipation that colored even the most mundane tasks at the laundry. Silas came to town twice a week now, always with some small excuse involving shirts that needed washing or supplies he needed to collect, though May suspected, and eventually confirmed through his own sheepish admission, that half his errands were invented purely for the chance to see her. He was, she learned during those visits, a careful and thoughtful man who had built his ranch from nothing after arriving in the territory as a young man with little more than a horse and a determination not to return to whatever hardship had driven him west in the first place, a subject he mentioned only once and did not elaborate on, and May, understanding the weight of unspoken histories, did not press him for more than he offered. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the town, and not everyone shared Ruth Kellerman's willingness to defend the arrangement. Otis Pruitt grew colder toward May with each visit, and she began to hear, second-hand through customers who still trusted her with their washing, whispers about Silas Reed losing his good sense over a Chinese widow who had surely set her sights on his land and his cattle the moment Way died and left her with nothing. The whispers reached a crisis point on a hot afternoon in late July when May arrived at the laundry to find her front window shattered, glass scattered across the floor amid a scrawled note weighted down with a rock, its message crude and unmistakable in its intent. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the wreckage of 6 years' careful work, and felt something inside her that had bent under 6 years of small cruelties finally threatened to break entirely. She did not send for Silas. She had spent 6 years handling her own crises without depending on anyone, and some stubborn part of her insisted on sweeping up the glass herself, on covering the broken window with a spare bolt of canvas, on continuing the day's work as though nothing had happened, because to do otherwise felt like surrendering something she had fought too hard to keep. But word traveled fast in a town the size of Prosperity Gulch, and by the time the sun began to set, Silas arrived at her door anyway, his expression carrying a controlled fury that May had not seen from him before, not even during the confrontation with Franklin Doss. "Who did this?" he said, not a question so much as a demand for a target. "I don't know," May said, though she had her suspicions, the same names that had always circled her business with quiet resentment. "It doesn't matter. I've dealt with worse." "It matters," Silas said. "You shouldn't have to deal with any of it, worse or otherwise." He looked at the broken window, at the careful patch job she had managed with the canvas, and something in his jaw tightened further. "I want you to consider something, and I want you to think on it proper before you answer. Not just say yes because you think it's what I want to hear." May waited, watching him gather whatever courage he needed for what came next, and found herself holding her breath despite her best efforts at composure. "Marry me," Silas said. "Not because of tonight, though I won't pretend this didn't push me toward saying it sooner than I planned. I've been thinking on it for weeks now. You could run the laundry from the ranch if you wanted, or not run it at all if you'd rather be done with this town's meanness entirely. Either way, you wouldn't be facing broken windows alone anymore." May felt the weight of the offer settle over her, practical and emotional in equal measure, and she understood, standing amid the wreckage of her shattered window, that this decision would define the rest of her life in this territory, one way or another. She thought of 6 years of careful, exhausting independence, of the particular loneliness of managing every crisis alone since Way's death. And she thought, too, of Silas Reed's steady hands and steadier honesty. The way he had twice now chosen to stand beside her, when doing so cost him something in this town's regard. "I need you to understand something first," May said. "I won't be a burden you carry out of pity. If I marry you, it's because I choose you, not because I need saving from broken windows and cruel notes." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Silas said. "Wasn't offering out of pity. Offering because these last weeks have been the best I've had since I lost my wife, and I don't want to go back to how things were before you agreed to that first supper." May looked at the broken glass still scattered across her floor, at the man standing in her doorway with his heart laid bare in a way she suspected cost him considerably, given his careful, quiet nature. And she made her decision with the same clear certainty she brought to every important choice in her life. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Silas Reed." 3 months later, the summer heat had finally begun to break into the cooler evenings of early autumn, and May stood in the kitchen of the ranch house 6 miles east of Prosperity Gulch, a house that had needed a woman's careful attention for 6 years, and now, finally, had one. The laundry in town remained open, run now with the help of a young widow named Charlotte Briggs, who May had hired and trained, giving both women an income and May the freedom to divide her time between the business she had built from nothing and the new life she was building with Silas. The broken window had long since been repaired, and Otis Pruitt, faced with the reality that half his customers now openly sided with May after word of the incident spread through town, had grown noticeably more careful about how he treated her on the rare occasions she still visited his store. Franklin Doss had left Prosperity Gulch entirely, for reasons that remain the subject of gossip May did not particularly care to investigate. Silas came in from the corral as the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, dust on his boots and a tiredness in his shoulders that spoke of a full day's honest work. And he found May exactly where he had come to expect her most evenings now, standing at the kitchen window watching the light change over land that belonged, at last, to both of them together. "Ruth Kellerman stopped by the laundry today," May said as he crossed the room toward her. "Says the town's talking about having a proper social this fall. Wants to know if we'll come." "What'd you tell her?" Silas asked, settling beside her at the window. "Told her we'd think on it," May said. "Same as you thought on marrying me before you finally worked up the nerve to ask." Silas huffed something close to a laugh, low and warm, and took her hand the way he had that first Founder's Day evening, careful and deliberate, as though the gesture still carried weight for him even after 3 months of marriage. "Reckon we'll go," he said. "Show this town what it almost lost the chance to have." May looked out at the land stretching toward the darkening hills, at the life she had built first from grief and stubbornness, and now from something steadier and warmer than she had ever expected to find again in this territory. And she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after 8 months of learning to live without it, as peace. "They stopped rejecting me the moment someone finally saw what I actually had to offer," she said quietly. "Funny how that works." "Wasn't luck," Silas said. "Was you. Same as it always was. Just took the rest of this town longer to notice than it took me." And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.